Life as We Know It with Tom Walton.
I pray for all the victims of mass shootings because I have witnessed firsthand the terror and tragedy that guns in the wrong hands can produce. Decades ago, I watched in horror as a young man murdered his wife and injured two other nearby women at the checkout counter of a discount store on Secor Road, a store known at the time as Tops. In late November of 1965, the Christmas shopping season was well underway. Late one afternoon, I decided to do a little shopping at Tops. For 20 minutes, I walked up and down the aisles looking for Christmas gifts and finding nothing in particular. Finally, I picked up a small dice game called Yahtzee and headed toward the checkout counters at the front of the store. Little did I know that several other lives were about to intersect with mine in a horrible way. While I waited for the cashier to ring up my modest purchase, a young woman approached and stood next to me. She wore a pale blue frock that identified her as a Tops employee. She began hanging small pots and pans on a display in the checkout lane. Suddenly, my conversation with the cashier was interrupted by an explosion to my immediate left. The woman in blue fell to the floor at my feet. Over her stood a man wearing a long coat and a fur-lined hunting cap with flaps. He clutched a pistol-grip carbine in both hands. Our eyes met for a second, and he raised the gun. I was certain I was about to die. Instead of firing at me, he lowered the gun and shot his wife a second time, this time in the back. Then he turned around and began walking away from the counter. Before I could process what had just occurred, he fired more shots, hitting two other women, a mother and her expectant daughter. They would survive, although a store employee told me later she heard the assailant yell that he hated women and was about to kill them all. There were more than 300 shoppers and 75 employees in the store at the time, and most were women. So this was a tragedy that could have been so much worse, but for the actions of two men, one a customer and one a department store manager at Tops. They tackled the man, knocking him to the floor, and wrestled the gun away from him. It was all over in less than 30 seconds. Well, what is the relevance of sharing this story 54 years after it happened? The gunman, just 22 years old, should never have been free to travel to Tops that day. He was seriously mentally ill. Just 3 days earlier, he had been released from the old Toledo State Hospital. This was a person firing at people with a weapon police described as a military-style carbine. In addition to the clip in the gun, the assailant had two more clips, each containing 10 bullets in his coat. He had far more mayhem to commit if two heroic gentlemen had not stopped him. Why would a person so ill be so armed? Not surprisingly, the gunman was judged insane. Years later, he was deemed competent to stand trial, and I was among those called to testify as a witness. He was convicted. Eventually, he died in prison, still a relatively young man. What happened at Tops in 1965 was a rarity for the times. Today, it is so commonplace we are no longer shocked. Millions of Americans consider responsible gun ownership a sacred right. Irresponsible ownership of weapons of war is not.
Life as We Know It is written and hosted by Tom Walton and is a production of WGTE Public Media. Life as We Know It with Tom Walton can be heard on WGTE FM 91 every Monday afternoon during All Things Considered at 5:44 p.m. Or hear past episodes at WGTE.org/life.